You're listening to a special, supersized episode of the Celluloid Heroes podcast, part of the LONGBOX CRUSADE podcast network.
New Tauntaun, Wampa, and action figures, each sold separately.
Han Solo! Help! Oh no! It's got Luke! Wampa! Watch it, Tauntaun! Gotcha!
New Tauntaun comes with an open belly rescue feature.
You'll be okay, Luke, as soon as I chase away that thing. Wampa! Wampa!
New Tauntaun and Hoth Wampa and other action figures, each sold separately from Kenner's Star Wars, The Empire Strikes Back collection.
Star Wars had been a success, right? Everybody was happy with it, right? Well, not if you were George Lucas. He had constantly battled with 20th Century Fox over their meddling with the film, and the experience of making Star Wars soured Lucas on the idea of ever directing a movie again. And that held true for the next 22 years until 1999's Star Wars Episode I, The Phantom Menace, and the remaining installments of the prequel trilogy were produced. But George had a plan, aided in part by Star Wars' blockbuster success. For all his trials and tribulations, making Star Wars granted Lucas the one thing he'd always dreamt of, which was financial independence from the Hollywood system. And he made good on that dream, relocating his company Lucasfilm from Los Angeles up to Marin County, California, where he would soon commence construction on his Skywalker Ranch production facility. Lucas was going to self-finance and produce his films his way, and he did just that, sinking a substantial amount of money from his Star Wars movie and from the merchandising into a sequel to one of his biggest hits. Unfortunately, that sequel was More American Graffiti.
Hey, baby, remember at the end of American Graffiti, you wish there was more? Well, there is!
It's More American Graffiti!
That's me, you idiot!
Come on, all you big strong men, Uncle Sam.
They're older and wiser, and just as crazy.
Yonder in Vietnam.
Uncle Sam says, I need the toad.
Terry the Toad's in Vietnam. Steve and Lori are happily married. Debbie's different.
Pregnant.
I'm in love.
John Milner's the same.
I'm John Milner, the owner-driver of this car here, and this is our team T-shirt. I'd be deeply honored if you wore it.
Jag talar ganska igen. Ni kom från Island.
She's a foreigner, John. It's my last shirt, too.
One more word out of your commie mouth, kid, I'll ring your neck.
Commie!
Turn around there.
I voted Republican! I can't control it! Get away from the trees, kid!
More American Graffiti. The bittersweet times. The crazy times. And all of it unforgettable.
A man is not a housewife. A woman is a housewife.
Ron Howard.
I'm having a party tonight. And my mother loved being a housewife, and my mother loved being a mother. And I'm coming to pick you up right now. Do you understand that?
Cindy Williams.
Your wife is a cow, your mother's a hog.
Charlie Martin Smith.
What's the matter? I broke my leg. Some guy's got all the luck.
Paul the Matt.
A little twerp.
Mackenzie Phillips.
We're me, John. I've grown.
A little bit.
Candy Clark.
I think it was a fire hydrant.
We're going to open up a used car line.
Bo Hopkins.
You sell them, we steal them.
They're all back and more. With the new stars of the 80s. Telling the story of the 60s. More American Graffiti.
And watch out, Joe Wolfman gonna be there too.
Lucas took the loss because he knew he had an ace up his sleeve with the movie everyone really wanted him to make, the sequel to Star Wars, which he had titled The Empire Strikes Back. He hired his old USC film instructor, journeyman director Irvin Kershner, to helm the film. With friend and Star Wars producer Gary Kurtz returning to run the show, Lucas felt comfortable enough to sit back in Marin County and manage his empire while nudging his best buddy Steven Spielberg along as the latter prepped the production of Raiders of the Lost Ark, conceived by Lucas as his answer to James Bond. Then problems arose. The Empire Strikes Back was soon running wildly over budget and well behind schedule. Kirshner was meticulous in every detail, bordering on Kubrickian in his obsession with getting every little detail just right. This irritated the shoot it fast, shoot it intense, assemble it in post approach Lucas had taken in all of his films. The tens of millions of dollars Lucas had earned off of Star Wars was depleting itself rapidly. Heavily in debt, he had to humiliate himself by going back to Fox and begging them to guarantee the loans from Bank of America in order to finish the film. This humiliated the independently minded Lucas, but with another expensive production, Raiders of the Lost Ark, waiting in the wings, Empire's tribulations exposed a problem he didn't quite realize he had until it was staring him in the face. Lucas's Empire depended on keeping people employed. He had his visual effects company Industrial Light and Magic. He had Skywalker Sound and his ambitious plans for Skywalker Ranch. He even invested in a small computer graphics company that would eventually call itself Pixar, but those successes were a long way down the road, and he eventually sold the division to Steve Jobs of Apple Computers. But amidst all the above, he had a payroll to maintain in order to keep his stable of artists, craftspeople, and technicians employed, and pointedly not lose that talent to one of the many rival FX companies popping up in the wake of Star Wars success. He couldn't do all of that while self-financing Raiders, Empire, and the planned third and final installment in the Star Wars trilogy, tentatively titled Revenge of the Jedi. He needed money, but he wouldn't go begging to the studios for it. He would make his own fortune and glory the old-fashioned way. And so, Lucas put Industrial Light and Magic out there to his rivals, the studios and producers and production companies looking for that SFX sheen audiences demanded to see. In short, Lucas hired out ILM to produce special effects for non-Lucasfilm productions to keep the cash flow coming in. And what ensued was a fresh new wave of cinematic creativity. With competing FX companies springing up everywhere, and with former IL employees like John Dykstra launching their own studios, the movies would never be the same again. It's easy to forget today, but the early 1980s were awash in sword and sorcery epics, some of which I've already mentioned, like Conan the Barbarian and the Sword of the Sorcerer, but also with the Beastmaster, Prisoner of the Lost Universe, Dungeon Master, Deathstalker, Ator, Sorceress, Conquest, and Mazes and Monsters, a TV movie starring a young Tom Hanks as a troubled role-playing game enthusiast who goes off the deep end, leading to a vertigo-inducing climax atop one of the World Trade Center towers. And there was a game called Dungeons & Dragons.
Your dungeon master has placed you in a dreadfully precarious position. You're playing the most phenomenal game ever created. Your skin grows cold from your first glimpse of the enormous beast. It's a product of your imagination. Survival depends on a quick, decisive move. Your choices are limited. Stand and fight, or run. Use your lightning bolt. Victory is yours.
Win the treasure.
TSR Hobbies, Dungeons & Dragons games. Products of your imagination.
The game was a way for bored and disaffected suburban kids to indulge in rich fantasy worlds among the cul-de-sacs and crescents and parks of their neighborhoods. We even see Elliot's brother Michael and his friends playing the game at the beginning of E.T. There was a great TV animated Saturday morning cartoon variation that remains one of Saturday morning's brightest points. Fun, engaging, surprisingly mature, and ended too soon, just as that boom of fantasy role-play and adjacent movies came to an end. By 1985, fantasy as a mainstream force was on its way out, aided in part by Twin Stinkers Red Sonja and Conan the Destroyer. Lucas attempted to revive the genre in 1988 with Willow, but audiences were as indifferent to that as they were hostile to his bombs Howard the Duck and Tucker, the Man in His Dream. Dungeons & Dragons the game, of course, endured, and is quite possibly more popular and mainstream now than it ever was. Of course, Dungeons & Dragons being a white suburban thing, it naturally attracted controversy, largely by white suburban moms under the guidance of their friendly local pastors and the moral majority. They claimed the game was satanic and demonic and encouraged wicked things like friendship and camaraderie and, worst of all, imagination, and that simply could not stand. The game was protested, picketed, and burned, upon a pyre of heavy metal albums and Stephen King novels because, for some, their dislike of a thing means preventing others from enjoying those things as well. Some things never change. Fantasy was never as respected in film the way science fiction was, and to this day it remains the bastard offspring of storytelling, complete with school boards banning Harry Potter and Twilight. Up until the Lord of the Rings trilogy changed the metric, fantasy was never as cool and never as accepted as Jedi and Vulcans and Xenomorphs. Fantasy remains the first genre the book burners and campaigning for re-election politicians always come gunning for. Fantasy is the domain of the nerdy, sweaty, acne-riddled, gawky, socially awkward nerds. The kids who don't know how to throw a football or change an oil filter. The ones who never really fit in with anyone, not even their fellow nerds, and are thus the easiest targets. I certainly proclaimed my sci-fi fandom loud, because even then I thought stories about wizards and dragons and damsels in distress were silly, despite privately loving book series like Lloyd Alexander's The Chronicles of Pryden, T.H. White's Once and Future King, and of course, J.R.R. Tolkien's marvelous Middle-earth stories. And yet, in the wake of Star Wars, it seemed almost predestined that fantasy would follow space opera down the primrose path. But it wasn't until 1981 that we got our first true post-Star Wars fantasy epic. It's taken nearly 40 years and a great deal of critical reevaluation since, before people finally realized that Matthew Robbins' Dragonslayer, co-written with frequent collaborator Hal Barwood, was and is one of the most memorable fantasy movies ever made.
Long, long ago, in the dark ages of sorcery, lived a powerful, monstrous creature. Its talons tear, its breath burns. It comes from a time of adventure, a time of wizards and spectacular magic, a time when dragons were real. Dragonslayer, at a cinema near you now.
Of all the early 80s sword and sorcery epics, Dragonslayer stands heads, tails, and wings above the rest of the pack. So much 80s fantasy was lower budgeted affairs, blanket lit, directed with all the enthusiasm of someone directing traffic. The monsters look rubbery, the battles haphazardly choreographed. What I think remains most fascinating about Dragonslayer is its maturity, not to mention its frequent and surprising gore. It's about the coming of Christianity to tame a savage land and unite those warring kingdoms under the Holy Cross. And while heroic Galen and Valerian win the day, the world the two of them inherit is a lot less magical than the one with the dragon rampaging across the countryside. It's a film that plays out in dead seriousness, and the weight of that story absolutely presses down on you from the opening frames. Dragonslayer, in a way, feels like the anti-Star Wars. Sorcerer's apprentice Galen, played by Peter MacNicol, is no Luke Skywalker. He's an arrogant, petulant hero who means well but causes a lot of destruction before he finally becomes the hero he always dreamt of being. There's no Han Solo figure to ground the story into more relatable territory, and the Princess Leia figure is partially devoured on camera by baby dragons. In place of Obi-Wan Kenobi, we have Ulrich, played by the legendary Sir Ralph Richardson, in a role almost as cold and chilling as his supreme being from Terry Gilliam's Time Bandits, a cold, hard man devoid of the warmth Sir Alec Guinness brought to his aged Jedi Knight. There is a Darth Vader of sorts in John Hallam's Enforcer Tyrion, but he's dispatched by Galen before the big event with Vermithrax. There's even an Emperor in King Cassadorius Rex, played by Peter Eyre, a cool, malevolent figure who emerges triumphant despite the evil he perpetuates and the losses he endures. Valerian, played by the great Caitlin Clark, begins the story disguised as a man, a subterfuge he's carried for years to protect her from the kingdom of Erlin's fiendish lottery, coming out of the closet metaphorically and physically after she and everyone else believes the threat of Vermithrax is past. Princess Elspeth, played by Chloe Solomon, is protected from the lottery by her royal lineage, and when confronted with this reality, makes the fateful and ultimately fatal decision that drives the rest of the story. This is not a movie where the hero saves the princess. It's a PG Disney film, co-produced with Paramount Pictures, that really pushes against the limits of its rating. Watching Dragonslayer, right away you notice how handsome a film it is. It looks frightening, and it looks big, right from the opening torch-lit processional through a blackened landscape. It felt genuine in a way other movies of the time did not. The entire film is dark and damp and feels like something filmed in the Dark Ages. Production designer Elliot Scott's work recalls his later work on Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom, and Derek Van Lint, the cinematographer of Alien, pretty much steals the show. When people talk of the look of Dragonslayer, they're talking about him. Dragonslayer looks like no movie made today, and very few movies even back then, with the exception of what Ridley Scott was doing. Frankly, Dragonslayer, not Legend, feels like the sword and sorcery movie Scott didn't make. There was no winking to the camera, no asides, no ironic postmodern detachment. Everyone commits to the part. These are flesh and blood people, refreshing to see in a world now where it too often seems our characters are merely a series of boxes on a list to be checked off one by one. Valerian is tough, feisty, and feminine, driven by her fears and overcoming them. Elspeth undergoes a character arc you wish you saw in main characters more often, let alone the second major female lead role in any film. And Galen, the erstwhile hero, learns what it means to be one, by showing humility in the face of things he doesn't understand, rather than just blunder through with a wink and a nod, and hope things work out. I think the real MVP, though, was a stop-motion animation wizard named Phil Tippett, and that company named Industrial Light and Magic. Tippett was, and to this day remains, a legend in stop-motion and in filmmaking, and if you're any sort of fan of sci-fi fantasy filmmaking in particular, you can probably name all of his major works. The comical holographic chess set in Star Wars, the fearsome AT-ATs in The Empire Strikes Back, the AT-ST chicken walkers of Return of the Jedi, Ed 209 from RoboCop, Kane from RoboCop 2, the bugs from Starship Troopers, and even the dinosaurs from Jurassic Park. Yes, even the CGI dinos of Jurassic Park came to life on screen thanks to Phil. Dealt a crushing blow with the decision to bin his stop-motion dinosaurs for computer-generated creations, Tippett, with support and encouragement from Jurassic's FX supervisor Dennis Muren and its director Steven Spielberg, designed and pioneered a stop-motion rig connected to ILM's massively powerful computers to essentially hand-animate the CG versions, imbuing them with a life and a personality that otherwise would have lacked. Years of studying movement paid off for Tippett in Jurassic Park, and I think that's why those CGI dinos have never looked as good or as believable as they did in 1993. But I would argue Vermithrax is Tippett's masterpiece. Vermithrax doesn't talk, she doesn't scheme. She's off screen for the majority of the film, but when she reveals herself to Galen and to us, rising from beneath a hellish lake of fire, the malice and menace she communicates by her body language alone perfectly demonstrates what so much of modern-day CGI lacks, that personality, those quirks and eccentricities that convey a living, breathing thing behind the scenes manipulating the creature well beyond tapping computer keys. Vermithrax has a weight to her, and in her scars, torn wings, and toothy snarl she conveys eons of age. She is an ancient beast knowingly near the end of her existence, yet raging against the coming end even she recognizes. Dragonslayer's pleasure is extended also to Alex North's experimental score, which recalls one he submitted to and was ultimately rejected by Stanley Kubrick for 2001: A Space Odyssey. In this case, North's music plays more like it belongs in a horror movie, not a fantasy, with its discordant, jarring notes played on instruments that sound like they were carved from bone. Dragonslayer is also a genuine horror movie at various points in the story. This is not a gauzy fairy tale, but rather a dark, dank, subterranean labyrinth with death lurking around every corner. And did I mention it's a Disney film? But to see Dragonslayer, you really needed to see it on the big screen, and I was lucky enough to convince my dad to agree to take me, probably because he wanted to see it too. We'd decamped to Edmonton, Alberta in early 1981, and would only spend 14 months there before moving back to Toronto. Memories of Edmonton remain fleeting for me even now. It was a cold place and a snowy one, with summers that were fine and good, but far too short. I think the year we lived there, the snow began around October, and when we moved at the beginning of April of 1982, it was still on the ground. But we saw movies there, a lot of them, some of which were unmemorable, like The Private Eyes and Saturday the 14th, plus some stone-cold classics like Raiders of the Lost Ark and Time Bandits, and of course Dragonslayer. Watching the movie's opening scenes in a darkened theater was an experience of mounting dread for me, and to this day I don't think I've experienced a more unnerving film. Just that anticipation of knowing that at some point I was going to see the horrible vermithrax projected high and wide before me. It was enough to keep my pulse running at a fairly rapid clip throughout. There's a physicality to the film that gives it an authentic feel that more modern movies with their digital backlots and CGI lack. The world feels lived in a way few fantasy films do. Believe in the landscape, and you will believe the beings that populate it, which makes vermithrax feel all the more threatening. The psychedelic spacescapes of the Marvel Cinematic Universe and Lucas's prequel trilogy, while spectacular in their own right, feel oddly airless, like trying to catch smoke in the palm of your hand. While Dragonslayer utilizes the same archetype Star Wars did, it flips them all on their head. The wizard Ulrich seemingly dies in an abrupt, pointless death 15 minutes into the movie. Galen is arrogant and foolish and makes mistakes that have dire consequences, but also learns humility and respect, and ventures into the dragon's den to defeat the encroaching darkness and render him and his magic-using kind obsolete. Clark's Valerian, the village girl who's spent her life hiding as a man to avoid the king's dreaded lottery, is tough, fierce, and feminine. A scene in the film when she comes out in her peasant dress at the celebration in the village square is both touching and moving as she is accepted for who she is. A maiden no longer in hiding. You see the fear in the eyes over how others will react, but also the hope. These are people she grew up with, ones who presumably had their daughters taken from them never to return. There is fear also in how Galen, who has kept her secret and she is slowly becoming attracted to, will react as well. You can read it all in Clark's face in that one moment, the fear as well as the hope. Clark, who died far too young, gives what is perhaps the best performance in a film teeming with them, all in one scene. But it was the final scene in the movie that left the most lasting impression on me. After Galen, Valerian, and a resurrected Ulrich have together destroyed vermithrax, King Cassiodorus Rex arrives, resplendent in his robes and finery, is handed a sword and sinks it into the dead dragon's carcass as a herald proclaims him Cassiodorus Rex, Dragonslayer. Then as now, it's the peasants who do all the heavy lifting while the powerful take all the credit. Cassiodorus' legend will ring far and wide, while Galen and Valerian will retreat into history, which is probably how they prefer it. The victory in Dragonslayer is a hollow one. The dragon has been vanquished, but as a result the magic that once held sway in this young and wild world is diminished. Christianity will rule the land. There's no place for wizards or dragonslayers in the earthly kingdom. Death by dagger and arrow, immolation of both a comely maiden and a priest, played by Ian McDiarmid, 2 years before his appearance as the Emperor in Return of the Jedi. Dragonslayer was an exercise in terror before we ever got a good look at the dragon. For me, it was an exercise in fear of what I would see when Galen, armed with the spear and shield, descended into the hellish subterranean lair to fulfill the title of the film. We were a long way from Disney's other most recent movie about a boy and his dragon.
Helen Reddy, Jim Dale, hi, Mickey Rooney, Red Button, Shelley Winters, Sean Marshall, and Elliot, the incredible super magical dragon.
I love you too.
In Walt Disney Productions' Pete's Dragon, rated G.
On reflection, Walt Disney's death may have actually been what saved the company from itself. The throw everything at the wall and see what sticks approach, from the 1970s through the 1980s, produced more flops than hits. What resulted was and remains a lot more interesting than the bland corporatized filmmaking that propelled the studio to unsurpassed heights in the decades since. Despite all the talent amassed behind the scenes, Dragonslayer, unfortunately, was not a hit. It was, in fact, quite a bomb, grossing a pitiful $14.5 million against a budget of $18 million. By comparison, Paramount's other big movie of that year, Raiders of the Lost Ark, earned $389.9 million against a $20 million budget. Dragonslayer came and went pretty quickly, yet despite that it did find an audience, a second life, and an eventual profit on home video. Despite being a flop, I can bet you more 80s kids recall Dragonslayer with a great deal more fondness than they do towards many of the other big hits of the same era. But this was a common story in the 1980s, where a film that underperformed at the box office could still turn out a profit in the then rapidly growing secondary home video market. Video essentially killed the need for a theatrical re-release. It was cheaper, the earnings more substantial, and home video drove the industry forward, giving cheap and cheesy productions from Canon Films and New World Pictures a market to fill, and also ensured that these films would never really fade away.
I am Morley, the wizard, introducing you to adventure. It's Dungeon Fantasy Board Game. This family is on a challenging adventure in a scary dungeon, seeking treasure guarded by strange and wonderful monsters. Take it from Morley, Dungeon and Dungeons and Dragons games from TSR play better. After all, we are the game wizards.
Now, when I began the Celluloid Heroes podcast, it was always my intention to bring in guests at various points in the narrative to share their experiences with the film of the particular month and episode. So, in that spirit of film camaraderie, I would like to welcome Dave Alexander to the show. Dave is a multi-talented, multi-hyphenate, a writer, director, filmmaker, author of the great book Untold Horror. He is also one of my former bosses from his time as managing editor of the world-renowned Morgue magazine. He is also a proud native of the city where I first saw Dragonslayer, Edmonton, Alberta. Dave, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me, man. This is a huge honor.
Well, let's start at the beginning here, the early years of Dave Alexander, and I'm curious to know what was your first, would you say, truly memorable cinema-going experience?
You know, I've been ruminating on this question a bunch, and, you know, the things come sort of through in snippets. I have this memory of my parents taking me to the theater to see, I think it was Empire Strikes Back, and I seem to remember they were playing Tom and Jerry cartoons before the film, as they did way back in the day. And, just sort of being overwhelmed by the sound and the visuals on screen, and probably being a little too young to sort of take it all in. And then I was thinking, well, what about something that's more fantasy? And I actually have a really clear memory that sort of sums up my childhood movie-going experiences a little bit. I grew up in Sherwood Park, which is a suburb of Edmonton. And back in the day, they had one theater. It was an independently owned theater called the Sword and Shield, which initially had 2 screens. It later got up to 4 screens. And it was just this sort of ugly brown seat, grotty little theater, but I loved it. And when I was old enough to get on my BMX bike and go on my own, I would go as much as I could and see whatever. And often I would see things twice because my options were limited. And I remember seeing Lady Hawk there, and really having this feeling of, I don't know, maybe it was my first sort of real fantasy film or awareness of seeing a fantasy film, and that I was in a different realm. And I remember being, you know, awed by the story of it. And I went back and I saw it again. I remember I saw it twice at the Sword and Shield, and that film, as far as fantasy goes, has a very special place. And then, of course, like everyone else, I, you know, of that era, of course, I consumed a ton of VHS. Anything I could get my hands on that I was allowed to rent, and the cover spoke to me, was fantastic. And, I mean, if we're talking about covers that really grab your attention, it doesn't get much better than Dragonslayer. And so for a kid to see that art, you're immediately curious. What's going on here? This is so cool. I need to see this.
I think, in part for me, the reason that so little memory of Edmonton exists is because my time there was so brief. Speaking from experience with many moves over many years, it generally takes you about a year, maybe closer to 2, to really feel settled into a place and a routine. And we just never had that opportunity. Just as we were getting settled, we were off again. So while I do recall specific moments and experiences of Edmonton, like vacations and, of course, movies, the rest is a blur. So with that all said, what would you say is characteristic of being an Edmontonian or an Albertan to you?
Well, I remember there was a stat years ago that I read that per capita, Edmonton had the highest number of people going to the movies, and it was attributed to the fact that you want to get out of the house in the winter and go do something, and what do? I mean, your options are limited. And, I remember before I was old enough to go to a bar, but you had access to a vehicle or, a friend could drive or whatever. Your options were go hang out at the mall, go to a restaurant, eat cheap fries, and, go to a movie. And, I love the movie experiences was fantastic. And when I didn't have access to wheels, and even when I did, I was always up at Jumbo Video. There were tons of rental places. I remember the first place we rented from the Video Movie House back when you had to buy a membership. And, I think Consumers Distributing also had like VHS tapes hilariously. And at one point you could even get them from like Canadian Tire. So it was this, you had access to all these films in a very certain way. And I do have a very early memory of my parents actually renting like a 16mm projector from the library and watching movies that way. And then soon after that, in 79, my dad bought a VHS player, which I realized in hindsight was a huge purchase for our lower middle class family. And so the fact that he got that, I think, spoke to his love of certain type of movies. And, I have a lot of really warm memories of family movie nights as well. And so that's my sort of my cinema culture. I remember the Edmonton Journal coming and getting really excited to see all the ads for the movies that were coming that weekend. And you just pour through it and see what you might have an opportunity to go to, and then trying to get money or access or whatever, a ride from your parents. Like, the more I talk about it, the more I realize my world revolved around that quite a bit. It extended from there. Like I said, you're in for the winter a lot. I would buy novelizations and soundtracks, and I would reenact The Road Warrior with my G.I. Joes, and, just develop into a real film nerd after a while.
Well, let's talk dragons, and specifically Dragonslayer. When did you first see this movie? Was it in the theater? Was it in video?
So I would have seen it in some form, way back in the VHS era. I did not see it in the theater. But I watched it again recently. I grabbed the 4K, I was gifted it by a friend, I should say. And, I knew we were going to chat about it, so I wanted to wait closer to the date to sort of go in fresh. And I realized that my memories of it, some of it were accurate and some of it was mixing together with other movies, stuff like Excalibur and maybe even Clash of the Titans. Watching it now, the level of appreciation that I have for the ambition of the special effects and the talented people that were working on it. I mean, Phil Tippett's in the mix. Disney sort of threw the full force of their studio behind it. And, it's a marvel to watch how they brought the dragon to life. And you can never make a film like that now. Nobody would spend that kind of money making a mechanical dragon. You could do it with digital effects. And just the world of it. I loved, and I don't think I would have appreciated this back in the day, but now I love the sort of dark and dirty world that it exists in. Some people in old reviews that I was looking at, they talk about they really nailed the dark and the dark ages on this film. You could see it. And so it has this real swamp water quality to it that I like, but I think was maybe one of the reasons that it didn't do so well. We can get into that a little more later. I have some thoughts on that for sure.
Well, looking back on it, 40 plus years removed, you look at the decade of the 1980s, particularly the first half, 1980 to 1985, and you realize just how big fantasy was. It really entered the mainstream in that decade, spurred by things like Dungeons and Dragons, obviously, and movies like this and ones that followed, like Conan the Barbarian and whatnot. But why do you think fantasy kind of broke through during that time period of the 1980s?
So I think there was a lot of things going on. I think Dungeons and Dragons role-playing, coming out in 1974, was building in popularity and laying a lot of the groundwork. At the same time, you got Heavy Metal magazine and sort of similar magazines that are featuring this Rosetta-style artwork and these stories that people are really into. Of course, Conan was a hit. You want sword and sorcery and that kind of stuff as well. I think really, though, one of the things that you were covering is there was an arms race with special effects. These guys work at these studios that had a lot of resources at their disposal, and there's kind of a one-upmanship. What can I do? How can I bring this to life? Oh, we can't do this. Let's find a way to do it. And I feel like this is definitely a product of that. And I think it's also important to mention that this is when home video is starting to boom, and the theater needs to compete with home video, so they want to offer spectacle. And this is coming out after Star Wars, and Star Wars was spectacle. And so, they want to have the next Star Wars, whether it's set in space or the Middle Ages or whatever, but it's got to have big, exciting creatures and epic storytelling features and, just stuff to get you to go back to the theater and see the second time because it's awesome.
Well, we should talk a little bit about Matthew Robbins here. He has had a really interesting, very eclectic career as a writer and also as a filmmaker. By chance, Dave, do you happen to know the movie he made just before Dragonslayer?
Corvette Summer?
Yep, you're right. You win the prize. It was Corvette Summer. And his follow-up film to Dragonslayer was The Legend of Billie Jean, which is a complete 180 from Dragonslayer, just like Dragonslayer was a complete 180 from Corvette Summer. He had one of those interesting careers that I guess never really took flight in the way he may have hoped, although quite an interesting career. Both him and Hal Barwood really broke through in the early 70s as screenwriters of The Sugarland Express, which, as we will likely know, was the theatrical film debut of Steven Spielberg, who had directed a TV movie called Duel that came out a couple of years before. And of course, the following year, 1975, he unleashed Jaws on the world, which really just launched his career into the stratosphere. But so he had an association with Robbins and Barwood. Because we can't really talk about Dragonslayer without addressing the elephant in the room, or in this case, the dragon in the room. And that's it. It flopped. It was a box office bomb, essentially. No fault of its own, really. On speaking of quality, if people are hesitant to check it out because it flopped, don't hesitate. Go check it out. It was just released at a really rough time, because I think it came out in theaters right around the time Raiders of the Lost Ark did, and Raiders just completely obliterated all the competition. And then, before it could kind of get its footing, Dragonslayer, then Superman 2 came out. First Blood, the first Rambo movie, came out. It was just a really busy summer, and Dragonslayer kind of fell through the cracks. But we kind of should address why it flopped. I mean, here's this movie that's almost got this legendary status now, either as a cult film or however you want to look at it. But the fact that it didn't do well and is so well loved now kind of tells a bit of a story in itself, doesn't it? Why do you think it flopped?
I think there's a bunch of different reasons. I mean, one of them is this is, a Disney product, and it's when Disney was sort of dabbling with darker content. And this is something I came up with. I read this online, people mentioning it, and it really makes sense to me. Sometimes these big companies, when the world is changing of cinema going, they dabble in different things, and it maybe pushes the edge of their brand or falls outside of it, and people aren't so much into that. I mean, this has, some brief nudity. It's really scary. There's some violence. There's, somebody's body being eaten by rats. Like, this is not typical Disney kind of stuff. It's one of the reasons the film is so cool, but there were probably parents that left partway through because this was too much for their kids to handle. So I think it's off-brand. in that way. And I think the casting is off for this. I think Peter McNichol's a really cool actor, but not as a leading man. He's not a Mark Hamill, Luke Skywalker type. And there's an archetypal journey that it sort of undercuts, right? If you look at Star Wars, of course, he's the reluctant hero. He's just sort of this boy, and by the end of it, he's a man having gone through this incredible journey and, got his magical sword and powers and all that other stuff. And Dragonslayer, I don't want to ruin the end for people who haven't seen it, but it doesn't end on the heroic note that something like Star Wars does and give you that good feeling walking out of the theater. And Peter McNichol he's more of a character actor for sure. I forget his character's name, but in Ghostbusters 2, that's the one that sticks in my mind. He's playing comedy here. He's sort of playing comedy, but he never goes through the hero's journey really in a way that's satisfying. He's too much, at the end of the film, he's too much like he is at the beginning of the film, kind of a bit of bumbling and sort of, a bit of a downer and not necessarily having the confidence, but then at some points he's actually overconfident and he's kind of a bit of a dick. And you can do all those things, but they don't really do it in a way that's satisfying or perhaps in a linear sense that works for this kind of a tale.
It feels like a movie. It feels very much, rather, like a movie that was written and conceived in the 1970s. It's a bit more of the anti-hero's journey than the hero's journey. I call it Star Wars without the warmth, or Luke Skywalker without the bright and sunny disposition. Galen's kind of arrogant and not always the most fun character to be around. He's kind of full of himself. So it very much feels like closer to something like, I want to say, Taxi Driver or Network than it does Star Wars or Indiana Jones. But at the same time, I think it's very progressive in its attitudes towards women, the female characters, the Princess Elspeth, for one, but Caitlin Clark's Valerian as well. And you can kind of look at it through a modern day lens and say, if they're going to make Dragonslayer today, make Valerian the Dragonslayer. Make her the apprentice to Ulrich, or have her have to step up when Galen, brags about being this great wizard and ends up not being, and she kind of has to step up. That might rankle some corners of the internet discourse, but that's neither here nor there.
Yeah, I think it would have been so much more interesting if Valeria was the main character, and it was from her point of view, because she is the most sort of competent and capable, and I would say interesting character in the film. And I also want to say that I really like what you said about it being run into the 70s. I had a little note towards that where this would have been written coming out of the 70s. And of course, starting with Jaws and then definitely, Star Wars, that's when the blockbuster era came. That, this is the Reagan era when we're getting, these big, shiny, happy Hollywood stories. And the 70s are really marked. Some of the best films are just absolute downers. Conversation is one of my favorite movies. Look at Taxi Driver. Look how these films end, right? And I think you're 100% right that this was written by this period, and by the time it got made, of course, because it would have taken a heck of a long time to go through the pre-production and the production, we're in a different era, and we don't really want to see, at least audiences at the time didn't want to see the filmmaker undercutting the template, I suppose. Of course, and again, that's what makes the film interesting, and I think that's what maybe has led to its longevity, because it offers something different, it offers something original. But you can totally see how the tone was off, like it wasn't reading the room of the early 80s, perhaps.
what I find really interesting about Dragonslayer now, particularly its almost resurgence in popularity or awareness, is it's a movie that I think has been very much resurrected by the filmmakers who were inspired by it. The big one being Guillermo del Toro, who has been a frequent collaborator on the written page with Matthew Robbins. They co-wrote Mimic and Crimson Peak, and Robbins did some screenplay, I guess, early work on his most recent Pinocchio. And if you delve into the long list on Wikipedia of Guillermo del Toro's unfinished projects or projects he was attached to and didn't make, of which there are many, it's kind of become a running joke in this business. You find a lot of them are co-written with Matthew Robbins. I think Guillermo just, when he touched down in LA, Robbins was one of the first people he sought out specifically because he was a big fan of Dragonslayer. And if you pick up the 4K Blu-ray and you listen to the audio commentary, which is by Robbins and Guillermo goes into what he loves about the movie, why it made such a big impression on him.
Well, I think it probably came out at the right time for Del Toro. And, he's a monster guy, and visually, this dragon is incredible. And I'm not sure, I had read a quote, and perhaps it was him, perhaps it wasn't, but I could see him saying that he thought this was the best dragon that had ever been put on screen, the look of it, the design of it. And he's huge on the design. He employs a lot of people to do different creature designs and bring the pre-production really far ahead in his films. So they're, visual forward in a lot of ways, or earlier on, or more so than some other filmmakers. And I think he also is such a film fan and a fan of the craft that he looks at this and he sees what they accomplished and how they, built this 40-foot long part of a dragon, and how they, strategically hid it in this really cool set, and it's monstrous and it's genuinely scary. And he likes genuinely scary, right? This isn't a puff movie. So I can see him liking that. He may also, I think, enjoy the world building in it a little bit, like the sorcerer's lair, and it's very rich visually, and I think that it probably speaks right to him. Absolutely.
I think the technological limitations of the time are in part of what really inspired Guillermo del Toro when he first saw it, because it very much utilizes the Jaws approach to hiding the shark, aka hiding the dragon, for much of the movie. You do see it here and there. You see it in flight. You see it emerging from this cave surrounded by steam billowing and everything. And obviously it's the type of thing that would really capture the imagination. But in looking at Guillermo's work, I see a lot of Dragonslayer in it. I think I really noticed it for the first time after hearing about the connection between him and Robbins in The Devil's Backbone, which features ghosts, and quite prominently in some cases, but for key parts of the story, the ghost is just there, just off screen, and he never shoves the creatures into your face and everything like that. He kind of layers them and introduces them into the story as the story demands it, compared to now where it just seems like they're sort of throwing all the spectacular stuff on the screen just to show off how spectacular it is.
Yeah, Mimic is the reason that Del Toro shoots all his own B-roll generally. Mm-hmm. He had such a terrible experience on that. He wouldn't give up control. He had us on set for Pacific Rim, and there were adjoining studios, so he would shoot a bunch of stuff inside the head cockpit of the big robot, and then he would go and open the door and go into the other studio where he would check on the B-roll stuff that was happening. And he would do 6 days a week sometimes, and the 6 days just B-roll on stuff. At one point I remember him talking about that. So, again, it comes back to him being an absolute craftsman and wanting to see a vision through. And Dragonslayer is a craftsman type film, and it's a very distinct vision. It's not a vision that was embraced by audiences of the time, but it's definitely one that's ready to be embraced. I'd say by genre fans who maybe want something a little more nuanced, a little more interesting. And I love Robert Altman films, and this reminded me of this is the closest thing to like a Robert Altman fantasy film, because he's throwing acid on these archetypes and just defeating your expectations and upsetting you. I mean, okay, again, spoiler for a 45-year-old movie, but I sure as hell didn't expect that the princess was going to get it, That never happens.
Well, not only does she get it, but it's quite horrific. And I think when people talk about this movie, people who've seen it, they always remember that scene. I won't go any further, but just say that scene always kind of left a scar on them. And in a lot of ways, this is one of those movies that almost challenges you to like it. It doesn't give you easy solutions, and it doesn't give you easy resolutions in a lot of ways, which I talk about in sort of the mainline part of the show.
Fun, weird little fact that sort of ties in. My uncle's tile company did the tile in the one Cineplex at West Edmonton Mall that had the huge dragon in the lobby. And I got to go for the very first night, the preview night when it was open. And the deal was every, 15, 20 minutes or something, this music would come on and it would build, and then the dragon would spit fire, and real fire would come out this thing and heat up the whole lobby. And it was pretty bonkers.
Only in the 1980s could you have a fire-breathing dragon, an actual fire-breathing dragon in a shopping center. Yet it did find its audience in the end, although that wasn't necessarily in the theater. It was on home video that it really kind of spread its wings and took flight. And I'm just kind of curious as to what your impressions are. How do you think it found an audience and became this cult classic?
From my own perspective, more simply, it just had a kick-ass cover. And for me, as a kid, that's all it would take is if I saw a cover that looked cool. You're always judging those books by the cover because you can't look it up online. And, you might have some friends that tell you to see something, but you just kind of go into the video store on a Friday night and your mom says, okay, you can pick out 2 things. Make sure your brother can watch one of them, whatever. And you just kind of wander around and you're trying to get the biggest bang for your buck. And so, you're drawn to the stuff that had the really, really cool covers. And I think it's also good part to give a shout out to the poster artist, Jeffrey Catherine Jones, who did that amazing, iconic image that's taken from the dragon's point of view, which I think is just so cool.
Yeah. Well, that's how we discovered movies before an internet. Nowadays, it seems you know everything about the movie before it even comes to theaters because there's trailers on YouTube and there's videos discussing the trailers on YouTube and there's, for years and years on websites, back in the old Ain't It Cool News days, there were early reviews and there were spoilers galore. And, that's just kind of how the discourse in film discussion developed. But back in the 1980s, you frequently didn't even know a movie existed until you opened up the newspaper on Thursday or Friday and looked through the movie listings. That's when they put the big full page ads up. And I know that with Dragonslayer, they must have sprung for some cash at the Edmonton Journal because it was a big full page color ad for Dragonslayer. And I think that may have been the first time I was aware that it existed. And then on the weekend of the release, there were commercials all over the place for it on television where I sort of said, no, I'm not going to do that. And then my dad took me anyway. But, it's a much different world. And I agree with you. I think that the people who skipped it in the theater for whatever reason, once they went to the video store and they saw this really great, funky, evocative artwork on the box, they said, hey, man, this looks cool. I like Dungeons & Dragons and fantasy and stuff like that. It could be a fun time. And I think that's kind of what Fuel did. If it lost money in its theatrical release, I'm quite certain it made it back on home video, which was just ironically, a monster for generating revenue for the studios beginning in the 1980s.
it's so hard to avoid spoilers. Mm-hmm. And, there was such a process, and, it's a little cheesy to say magic, but, it felt that way to go to this store that has all these, rectangles with artwork on it, and it's up to you to choose wisely or poorly, to find something that, if you like it, you're going to try to watch it 3 times over the weekend before it has to go back. And, even if you don't like it that much, you're going to stick it out because, it costs money.
Well, you guys were really early adopters because we didn't get our first VCR until, I want to say it was either Christmas of 1982 or possibly as late as 1983 that we got our first VCR. And that's how I experienced and re-experienced a lot of movies over the years. And that kind of really began my education, my personal home education, pre-film school education as a filmmaker. Because when you watched a movie multiple times, you really started to analyze the technique behind it, the shots and the compositions and the edits and all those things, all the choices that the filmmakers and the actors and the craftspeople made to tell that story. And, it probably would have begun with movies like Dragonslayer for a lot of people, like Guillermo del Toro and other people who are influenced by it. But our time is running short. We've probably gone on way too long already. What final thoughts do you have about Dragonslayer and just the experience of it?
No, I mean, I work in film now and I see a lot of what goes on behind the scenes, and then, writing my own scripts and trying to pitch and all that fun stuff. And so I now have a more holistic understanding of okay, well, this is what they were trying to do with the story, and these are the limitations they were up against, and here are the creative solutions they found to make it work. And, this probably cost this much. And there was some stuff in Dragonslayer I was like, how did they do that? I didn't understand how they did that shot. And that's amazing. And, you're trying to figure that out. And there was another level of appreciation where I'm like, oh, there's no way this didn't heavily influence Game of Thrones. The look of the dragon, especially when they're flying. And then I went online to check, and sure enough, George R.R. Martin, huge fan of Dragonslayer. So obviously, this film has had a bigger imprint on cinema and TV or pop culture, whatever, than I think most people realized. And so it's nice to see it getting this deluxe release and people talking about it and appreciating the work that those guys did. Some of it's so pioneering to make this dragon, come to life. And it is like Jaws in a way where they drip out bits of the dragon and get you more anxious and more excited. And I think that in itself is a skill. Like, how do we get the biggest bang for our buck from this monster and really get people with it? And, say what you want. We criticize some things that are worth criticizing, casting, etc. The dragon's pretty unimpeachable, man.
Well, Dave, thank you for joining me on this journey back to the Edmonton, Alberta of the 1980s. If people want to know more about you and your work, where can they find you?
You can find me on Instagram. I don't do much for social media outside of that. But I'm at Only Blood or Love, which is a blues lyric I grabbed from Dax Riggs. And I've been writing and pitching stuff in the scripted and unscripted world, trying to get my own stuff made, and in the meantime working on other people's films. So keep pretty busy. A couple of years ago, I put out a book through Dark Horse called Untold Horror, which tells a story of genre films that didn't get made, and we interviewed people involved. So love if people check that out. Very proud of it. And hopefully it's emblematic of my true cinema nerdiness.
I will jump in here just to say that Untold Horror is a really good book if you're a film fan, if you're a horror film fan, but I think also if you're a filmmaker or an aspiring filmmaker, just to get some stories of the behind-the-scenes battles to not get a movie made.
Yeah, I mean, would it be too cheesy to say trying to make films like trying to slay a dragon?
No, they are remarkably similar, and there is nothing too cheesy for this channel. I delve into it all the time, but I can think of many pitch meetings, production meetings, where having a spear and some dragon scale armor and a shield might have come in handy. Again, Dave, thank you so much for coming on, and we'll talk again soon.
Thanks, man. Congrats on the podcast. Thanks for having me. Always a blast. And yeah, love for Dragonslayer.
And that brings us to the end of this episode of Celluloid Heroes. I really hope you enjoyed it because Dragonslayer is a movie with a lot of meaning to me. For now, though, you can follow me on Instagram at the Celluloid Heroes Pod and at my website, brightabraham.com, where, as always, I post show notes, audio and video clips, and a lot more. Have a comment, question, or compliment? Reach out to me there, and I will answer. Celluloid Heroes is, of course, also a proud member of the LONGBOX CRUSADE podcast network. You can follow the show on Apple, Spotify, and YouTube through there. I'll be back next month, though, with a look at the movie that became my gateway to the madcap world of Monty Python's Flying Circus. I'll see you then.